Hello and welcome to episode 153 of the Rollo and Slappy Show. Today is July 15th, 2019. I am Rollo McFlugel, and with me is Slappy Jones 2. We are both, of course, from McFlugel.com. The show notes page for this episode will be McFlugel.com/153. You will be able to find things we talk about as well as checking out our sponsor, LibertyMugs.com, where you will find awesome libertarian and Bitcoin-themed mugs and maybe even a tractor-themed mug here and there. And also check out 10hoursofbitcoin.com, where if you're interested in learning about Bitcoin, but you don't know where to start, you don't know where, the economics or the technical stuff may seem over your head, just go over there. And there is 10 hours of content curated just for you to get you onto a path of understanding the value proposition of Bitcoin and understand why so many of us are so bullish on it in the long term. So that will be in the show notes page. That is 10hoursofbitcoin.com. And also, if you click the donate button on the bottom of that website, you can go see how to make a nice chunk of money by helping us with a wiki of Bitcoin attackers, or if you want to donate to just help us out that way, that's great too. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Slappy, to introduce our episode. Or actually, let me kind of introduce it a little bit, and because you're kind of going to be the interviewee for this one. But it was a little bit of time ago, kind of recently, last couple months, I guess. You were doing something that a lot of libertarians talk about doing or being involved in, but may not exactly have the opportunity to do. You were on a jury for a trial. So what was that all about?
Yeah, so it was a federal criminal case, conspiracy to distribute PCP. There was 7 defendants. It was a long trial. It was several weeks. I haven't talked about this, not at all on the podcast. I obviously have talked a lot about it to Rollo and some other people. But even friends and family, I haven't talked a ton about it. It was a very, I guess everyone will handle things different way, but it was very stressful for me. It was a big decision when you're in federal criminal court. There's a lot of responsibility, or these are very serious charges is I guess what I'm getting at. And you need 12 people to agree. It's not easy to do, especially because they rarely go to court to begin with. Most of them are pled guilty to. And so we all talk about, well, not all of us, a lot of us talk about nullification and being on a jury. And nobody likes to be on a jury, with good reason. It kind of throws you into something I didn't really want to be a part of. Of course, we always think about it, like I said, and think of the idea and how fun it would be to be on a jury and just like stick it to the state, But it was very stressful. It's very hard. It's a long process, and it's an intimidating process on top of that. So I'll answer any questions you have for me. I could talk for a long time on this case. It was a very long case. It was several weeks, a couple months. So, that's time out of work, time away from the family. I was not sequestered for it. I did get to go home at night, but my short commute to work became a very long one to the federal courthouse. So it was a couple extra hours a day in the car. But anyway, it's still, if you can tell by the way I'm talking, it's still a little uncomfortable talking about it. I just didn't like the whole experience, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Sure. So maybe before we get into, because I want to talk about what it's like being on a jury, because like you said, I've never been on a jury, and I had before talking to you about this, I had certain expectations that ended up being very wrong when what it's like to be on a jury after you kind of explained what it's like. And so I think it's very valuable there's a lot of libertarians, I think they fall on both sides of the fences, and I've been on both sides to say like, hey, I'm going to do everything I can to not be a slave and have them use my labor to be on a jury. And, if that's if you're going to be miserable on a jury, then maybe don't get on it. But for those that do want to get on it and try to do something good for the people there and try to work against the state, like you said, I think it's unless you know someone or have been on a jury yourself to understand everything that goes on and how it's not quite that simple. It could be pretty not only pretty stressful, but you could actually, really kind of mess things up. But I don't want to tell your story. So let's do you want to kind of give a background for what this case was like before we talk about, because I think that'll help make sense of what you were trying to do as a juror, really trying to do the right thing with this. So could you give some background for what was going on with this case?
Sure. Well, I'll talk. So here's one thing I want to put out there. Since the trial ended, I've talked to a few of the attorneys who were on the case and even some of the defendants. And like I said, there was 7 of them on trial, and we did acquit a few of them. So that one of them at least agreed to come on our show. So we may get that done. So this is what I kind of wanted to do here is before they come on, give my perspective and my experience as a juror, and then we'll have one of those guys come on and talk about their experience as a defendant. And we can see what matches up, what I was thinking versus what they were thinking, or any questions there. So I'll start, from the very beginning, because I do like to tweet about jury nullification. And so every now and then people will send me a DM or tweet at me that they have jury duty. And we have conversations and they ask what you should do. And the reality is I don't know. I did get on a jury. I was shocked I was on the jury. I thought if they had asked me any questions, I would be off the jury. And so they never did, there was voir dire, but I guess I'll explain that process. So I guess I'll start just from the beginning of I got a letter in the mail, or a survey in the mail to fill out, to complete for jury duty. This was probably 3 years ago. No, it was 2 years ago. It was 2 years ago in the summer. And they give that threat, it must be back within whatever days, and otherwise you'll be summoned or whatever. What I've understand is if you throw that in the trash and never reply, nothing happens to you. They just keep sending it to you. And I guess if it goes past 3 or 4 times, they might actually call you and tell you to do it. So anyway, I completed the survey. I sent it in and I heard nothing for several months. Got a jury duty notification for, was it probably back in October or November of 2017. And it said to call the night before. So I called them. I had 3 days or one trial. I called the night before. I didn't have to go in. Then they send me a letter saying you've been dismissed or not dismissed. I forget what they say, that you will be called again in the future. But I didn't hear anything for over a year, or I don't know how many months it was, about a year. When I got another letter, I'm thinking the same thing. I'm going to call. They're not going to need me. I'm not going to have to go. The first night I called, that's what happened. Second night I called, they said, you must report to jury duty. They gave me the address, and I went down there in the morning. So I thought, okay, here I am. This was a huge room. There was about 300 people in this room, and we're all sitting around. I'm drinking coffee, which was free. I guess, we paid for it, but drinking my coffee in the back.
I paid for it, Slappy.
I drank the one that you paid for, actually.
Okay.
So thank you. I did make sure that I got that one.
Good.
I've had jury duty before. This wasn't my first experience being in jury duty, but it was my first one with federal. And so typically I go to jury duty and I sit around all day and I go home. I've never gotten called for voir dire. I've had it for probably 4 times. Between the 2 counties I've lived in. And so I kind of I went into this expecting not to be on it because I have had it several times. I never got picked. And then I go into this room, and when you're at jury duty for the county, at least in my experience, there's a lot of people, but maybe 50, 60 people. There was a ton. This room was huge. It was full. And they tell us they're going to call a jury, and my name was the very first one called. So I was sitting in the number 1 seat, and they called 120 people, and that was about half the room, if that. So that's why I estimate about 300 or so, 240 to 300. There's a lot of people in there. And that's when we got called up to voir dire. So there's about 120 of us in the courthouse, in the courtroom, with the defendants, the U.S. attorneys, the judge. Everyone's in there. I was in the jury box because I was number one. So the first 16 of us were in the jury box. Everyone else was seated in the rows in the courthouse. And the judge did voir dire, which I listened very carefully to the questions.
Can you explain what voir dire is? I don't even know what that term is.
I don't know what it translates to, but it's when they question the juries to find out if there's any biases.
Okay.
And this was, this is where people, you'll hear anyone who gets jury duty, I don't want to be on it, I'm going to tell them I'm a racist or whatever, or I hate the cops. And that is probably a good way to get off the jury. And I didn't want to be on the jury. I didn't think I would be on the jury, but there was something in the back of my head, like, we talk about this all the time. Here's an opportunity. So to say, I mean, if I really didn't want to be on, I could have made a scene, and I don't know if they arrest you or what they do, but I wouldn't have been on the jury. So they asked the voir dire questions, and they were questions, I don't have them in front of me, but they're questions like, would you have a problem believing the testimony of a police officer or because they're a police officer, or would you be able to believe the testimony of a defendant because they're a defendant, or something like that? So I was listening very carefully to them, and I do believe I answered them all truthfully. Because it says, could you, say things like, could you put your personal biases aside and make a decision? And yeah, I can do that. And so I answered truthfully. And I answered all of them. And then they dismissed us. We went to lunch. We had to be back in like 3 hours. It was a long break. We sat up in another courtroom where they then brought the judge, not the judge, it was someone who works there. I don't know if it's a clerk or whoever it is. She would get up there and call out juror numbers like number 10, 15, 26, 35, 45, please go to the back of the room. And then someone would escort them out, and they'd go back down to the original courtroom we were in, where the attorneys and the defendants and the judge were, and they would ask further questions. I never got called down into that room, so I was feeling pretty good. I'm like, they're not going to put me on a jury without talking to me. But then it got to about 4 o'clock, and they called out a whole bunch of numbers. I was one of those numbers. They called out about 45 of us at this time. And we went back down to that courtroom where the judge and the defendants and the attorneys were. And we sat in order by number. And I sat there for about 50 minutes. No one said anything. The attorneys were talking to each other, and they're going back and forth. And you see them scribbling stuff on their notepads. And I guess that's where they were making their challenges. Challenge, I think each side, if I understand it correctly, gets 4 challenges that are you can't dispute, and then you can make other challenges for cause. And that gets a juror off the jury. So that's what they were doing. And I guess they settled on their jury because the judge called out the numbers, and I was one of those numbers. I was number 1. So I went into the number 1 seat in the jury, and that was the start of the trial. I mean, it happened quick. No one says anything to you. You don't really know what's going on. The judge swore us in, told us to be back at 9 o'clock the next day. So, excuse me. I don't know what I did to get on the jury. I was dressed business casual. I wasn't talking a whole lot. I wasn't being loud. I wasn't being opinionated. I didn't say the word nullification, which I'm sure would have got me off the jury. But I just kind of kept to myself and assumed I wasn't going to be on. I've never been on one before. They didn't ask me additional questions. And then it just happens. You're there. So, and that was one of the, I had to call my boss, tell them I'm on the jury. And he was really good. He worked with me to make sure I'd be okay. People would take over my work as while I was out. But that was a very stressful night because the judge told us it was going to be a 12-week trial.
Wow.
And now you're thinking I'm stuck, and I didn't know what to do. And then you're at this point where all you knew about the case was that it was a drug case. You didn't know anything else. You didn't know. We knew that the defendants were Muslim and that it was a drug case. And they, so puts you in a tough spot as a juror, just because I already kind of knew how I was going to vote, but I got to be here for the next 12 weeks. I'm going to be missing work. I'm in sales. That can be very expensive. And just the whole thing was just it was kind of a whirlwind. And that was just the beginning of the trial. They said show up the next day, so we show up at 9 o'clock the next day, and it just started. There's no instruction. There's no here's what you're going to do. Here's the order. Here's who's going to talk. They don't introduce you to the people. You just show up and they go. So I forget what your question was, and I'm sure that didn't answer it, but that was just kind of the lead up to it.
No,
I don't know how
and
I
that's
got
good.
picked. I have no clue how I got picked. I didn't want to be on it, like I said, but I was, and then then you're stuck. And then I switched into thinking about how I'm going to handle this thing. So anyway, ask if you have any questions. Ask for me. I'll talk about the case. I'll talk about deliberations, what the jurors know, what they don't know, whatever you got.
Yeah, can you talk about like what the actual case was? I mean, what you just everything you just said was was what you should have said instead of what I was asking. But maybe just give a the summary of what the case was about, just so that people can understand a little bit what's going on. Because it's again, this like stuff isn't necessarily cut and dry, especially that you said there's 7 defendants.
Yes,
in this case,
there was. Another thing, the reason I mentioned earlier that I have spoken to the defendants is that I've learned a lot since the end of the trial. And so I'm trying to do this episode without that knowledge. So just kind of from my perspective of what was going on through the case, what I was, what I was going through and what we know and what we saw. And then when we bring him on, we can talk about some of the other stuff. Sure. But this was a conspiracy to distribute PCP, which is phencyclidine. It's drug. It could be in powder form or liquid form, as far as I know. In powder form, they call it angel dust. But this was all liquid PCP, in which you buy a little glass jar, about an ounce, costs $250. At least at the time this was going on. And you dip cigarettes into the vial, into the little jar, and you smoke it. And that gets you your high. Costs about $10 a dip, and you sell about 50 of them per ounce. So just to give you a perspective on what kind of money we're talking about. So you have a gallon of it. That's a lot of PCP.
Sure.
So there was 7 guys who were indicted. There was actually more. A few of them pled guilty. We didn't know this at the time, though. We just knew the 7 were on trial. They had a main guy you could tell that the government wanted to go after, and the other guys were kind of ancillary to the main guy. At least that was my perspective. They got most of their evidence from a wiretap on his cell phone. They also had pole cams, which is just exactly what it sounds like. They set up a camera on top of a telephone pole. And just like in Sopranos, they do it like they pretend they're Pico. Pico is Philadelphia Electric Company. And they just go up there in the trucks and they put on a camera, and it was a motion sensor, motion detection. It didn't catch everything, but it caught a lot. They also did some mobile surveillance and stationary surveillance. Stationary is when you just sit in the car across the street and watch. Mobile is when you follow someone. And they had a confidential source, which was a very interesting part of this case. Just some kind of, I don't know what direction you want me to go in, but the confidential source is what got them the information to apply for a wiretap, which they did. Through the wiretap, they were able to identify the other guys in this case, and that's how they were indicted. It was all from this wiretap, which they got from a confidential source, but there was questions all over this confidential source and the way they handled them. It was actually kind of surprising to me that the judge allowed this, but I don't know the law as well as the judge. So that's just my opinion.
Sure. So it sounds like that, they did a lot of surveillance. They had this informant. And so it sounds like on the surface that the state built up a pretty big case against these guys. But, you said that you just didn't want to go in and just say, I'm just nullifying this, that you actually made the decision that these guys were not guilty. So what led you to come to that conclusion based on, everything was going on? What was the matter with this, all the evidence that the state was bringing against these guys?
Sure. So, all right. So first, there was a lot of questions all over the investigation that even the DEA agent admitted to, and he kept saying his defense was, well, I made a mistake. I messed up. That was a mistake. That was a mistake. So that's why I said it was surprising to me that the judge allowed this. And there was a reason for that I'm not informed enough to really understand and explain. But I was told why the judge allowed it, because I did ask one of the attorneys. But here's the thing, and we'll just cut a long story short. When you go into deliberations, what I was thinking, this was a long trial. I had a lot of time to think about this. I heard a lot of evidence. I heard, I tried to have lunch with every single one of the jurors. Since this was a long trial, I know some trials are only 2 or 3 days or even 1 day maybe. This was a long trial. So I tried to get to know every juror and be very friendly with them and not let them know my politics, my opinion, my philosophy, whatever. Just talk to them about family, about sports, whatever. Do small talk. I actually met a guy on the jury we've become friends since then. But I really tried to make a point to sit and talk to everyone so that they can at least, it was my hope, they would think I'm a reasonable person. I'm not a crazy, like, hate the state kind of guy. I'm a reasonable, normal person you can have a conversation with, and I think through these things. And that was kind of my goal from the beginning, is to meet with everyone, because I knew when we got to deliberations that this was going to be tough. And it was very hard. We were in deliberations for a week, or maybe a little more than a week. And there was a lot of disagreement in there. And to get to, I guess, the point, what I want to say is, had I gone into deliberations and just said not guilty, we would have gotten nowhere. We would have gotten absolutely nowhere with these other jurors. So my strategy when going in was, let's convince the other jurors that they're not guilty. And so I listened very carefully to the defense. And part of my thinking in that is, if everyone pleads guilty, and I looked up the statistics, in Eastern District of Pennsylvania in 2017, over 97% of drug cases got guilty pleas, never went to trial. And I looked this up after the fact, but I knew this because if you're in these libertarian worlds, you hear these statistics all the time. There's such a high, the state is or the government is very good at getting people to plead guilty and avoid trial. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, if these guys are going to fight these charges, they better have a really good case, because everybody pleads guilty. However, that's not how the other jurors, and I don't want to speak for them, but I did have really intense conversations with them over that week. Most of the other jurors have it in their mind that this is the United States. You get arrested, you get your day in court, and the jury decides, and it's a fair system, and that's how it works. And I made better choices with my life, and that's why I'm not in that chair. And these guys are guilty. And that glosses over all the evidence we looked at. But knowing that you're talking to people who have that mindset, if I go in there and say not guilty, yeah, I can get a mistrial for everybody, and that's fine. And I can be proud of myself, and I can pat myself on the back and say how good I did. However, the government, especially the federal government, has unlimited resources. They're going to retry it. They don't care about the cost of a long trial. They put their time and effort and money into getting these guys, and they're going to get them. And so had I gone in and just shut down conversation and said not guilty, we're getting a mistrial. No one, this, anyone listening to this podcast probably knows this from just talking to your friends about who will build the roads. Like, they just shut down when you say you don't want government. It's like they can't even contemplate that. You have to be able to get a conversation with them, ask questions, get them going down that path in order to come to their own conclusion. And so that was my intention. Because what I wanted was the best possible outcome for these guys. And so I listened hard. I took good notes. I listened to the defense, and I do believe they were not guilty. And so I was able to convince, and I don't want to take all the credit. I did have some jurors who were with me pretty much from the beginning. They never wavered. There was two other people who were right there with me the whole way. And I thank God they were there, because when you show up to deliberations every day and most of the room hates you, it's very awkward. It's a very stressful situation to show up and you're going to get shouted at, you're going to get yelled at, and you're going to sit there all day, and you got to come back, and no one wants to be there. Everyone wants to go home, and you're the reason they're not going home. It's tough. Someone at one point, one of the jurors picked up a chair to throw it. We had a juror crying, and I could go. I mean, I don't know how much detail you want me to go into. At one point, I used an analogy to explain the relationship, because a conspiracy is it's a very nuanced and very specific charge. The defense was actually, yes, these guys use drugs, they sell drugs, but this was not a conspiracy. And the government did a great job of scaring the jurors into saying guilty for some of these people, or at least voting for guilty. And so if you just nullify the whole thing, they get retried, and who knows what the next jury is going to be like. These guys, a conspiracy charge is very serious. I found out after the trial how many years these guys were looking at. Some of them were life in prison. And so if you just go in and say not guilty and they get retried, well, how does that help the defendant?
Well, can you go into explaining a little bit about that? You said they used drugs, they sold drugs, but didn't have a conspiracy. I mean, because I know that is a lot in libertarian circles. We hear it all the time. It's like someone gets charged with a crime, and it's like a crime for committing XYZ, then also conspiracy to commit crime XYZ. And it just seems like piling on, but this is maybe a case where it's not necessarily piling on, but it's something that they're getting charged with that's just kind of flat out false. Because it sounds like that it wasn't just the state didn't necessarily got the wrong guys or something. It was like these
people were involved, and actually some of the defendants stipulated. So,
but why is it that you're like so? I guess that's the thing. What was it, and why are you so confident that this charge shouldn't be applied? Sure. Not that you could just say like, well, I disagree that drugs should be illegal, so I'm just going to say not guilty for that reason. But even on their own terms, the government's own terms, that you believe that we're not guilty.
Sure. So I tried to pull this up. I went on Pacer, which is a system that has all the court filings that you can log in and get. I went into this case and tried to get as much as I could. They don't have the final. I wanted to get the voir dire questions, which they're restricted, and I don't know why they're restricted, but I'm not able to look at them. Same with the juror instructions, but I did get the proposed juror instructions. Now, these were the juror instructions that the government provided. So the government provides for the judge, and I guess the defendants can too. And then they go back and forth and talk and work it out and get the juror instructions. The juror instructions were about 130. I think it was 134 pages, 135 pages. It was a lot of reading, but that is literally the juror instructions. So all the definitions, everything you should be looking at. It doesn't talk about the evidence. It just talks about how you should decide the case. And one of the instructions was single versus multiple conspiracy. So there's three parts to a conspiracy, and why I don't know these off the top of my head is a good question, because I read that document so many times. But what I do know, it has to be one common goal. It has to be a common goal. The participants willingly entered into this plan into this goal, and they knowingly entered. There's three parts to a conspiracy, but the charge is a single conspiracy. And that's where it gets a little fuzzy. So if you read the definition of a conspiracy, you say, yes, they're all guilty. There's a conspiracy here. They all knew what they were doing. They all willingly entered into it. And they all, part of it is you don't have to even act as long as you agree or you're in on it. You can be included in this. And then it's funny too. One of the instructions is any action that any member of the conspiracy does can be attributed to all members of the conspiracy. So if you can set that there's a conspiracy, anything that happens in there can be applied to all the members of the conspiracy. And I believe, while I don't know this, but I believe this was kind of put in for like organized crime, where you have a mafia boss who doesn't actually pull the trigger, but since you can set up the conspiracy, you can put that murder on him. I don't know if that's true, but that kind of makes sense to me why they would do that, or at least makes sense in a government world why they would do that. But then, of course, it gets applied to everything. And so one of the instructions was single versus multiple. So once you establish that there is conspiracies, it has to be a single conspiracy with a single common goal. And so what that would be, what the difference between single and multiple is, if Rollo, if you and I enter into an agreement to do whatever, and then we go forward with it, that would be a conspiracy. Now, where a single conspiracy is there's one common goal versus separate agreements. So the defense was, yes, these guys all entered in a conspiracy, but it's multiple conspiracies. And the way the defense attorney did it is he would put the main guy in the center and then would have lines drawn out to all the other defendants, and it would be like the spokes. And he would say it's a rimless wheel. These were all separate agreements. They're all independent contractors working on their own behalf. This is not a single conspiracy. They didn't have a common goal. They weren't kicking money up to the guy in the middle. The guy in the middle wasn't telling them to go sell or directing them where to sell. It was all separate agreements. And that is important, because that's what differentiated it from a single conspiracy. If the guy in the middle was on the phone saying, Rollo, you go down to 3rd Street, I need you to be selling, or why aren't you selling more? Why didn't you give me my piece? Or, you're not kicking money up to me. That would have been evidence of a single conspiracy. There was absolutely no evidence whatsoever that any of that happened. It was all buyer-seller relationship. If someone wanted to buy PCP, they called this guy, they got it. That was the end of it. The guy in the middle never asked for money back. Never told anyone where to go, never said we're in this together. They didn't have a gang name. That it was just a guy selling to another guy. But I will say these juror instructions are very confusing and very contradictory. And I think that's done on purpose. Like some of the instructions would say something like, buying on credit could be an indication that it's a single conspiracy, but buying on credit alone does not necessarily mean it is a single conspiracy. And so you're like, well, then what the hell does that mean? So I just shouldn't, there was a ton of things like that in it. But the bottom line was, and what the defense was, and again, the judge allowed this defense, was that these guys were independent contractors, not members of an organization, which is what a single conspiracy is. And that's why I say all these guys were innocent of the charges of conspiracy. But you would be shocked how much a fight that was in deliberations.
Well, why? Let's take a step back for a second. Why do you think that the state was trying to do the single conspiracy charge? Were they trying to get like the kind of like kingpin kind of thing and be able to say, like, look at this huge organized drug ring that we cut down? Was it just for feathers, just simply for feathers in their cap, do you think?
That's what I believe. They obviously don't tell me that, but that's what I believe, because these guys, if they wanted to put these guys in jail, they could have done it very easily. The difference is it wouldn't have made the headlines. It wouldn't have been, we busted up a big PCP ring. And the reality is these guys weren't like, this wasn't the cartel. These guys aren't living in some compound driving exotic cars and all the women. These guys were you walk past them in the street and not think anything of it.
Sure.
I know how much they got caught with. It was a lot relatively, but it wasn't. We're not talking about a huge major drug operation. There isn't a single. It's not like no one in Philadelphia could get PCP after they busted this thing.
Right.
But with some of the defendants, like one of the defendants who we did acquit, there was no evidence at all that he had anything to do with PCP. He sold codeine to the main guy, and they put him on this conspiracy charge. And I actually did sit down and talk with him. And that was actually exactly what he told me. Cause I said, so why didn't they just charge you with codeine? They knew you would get that. He said, cause there's no jail sentence with codeine. But if you put me into this PCP thing, you spent a lot of time in jail. These guys were looking at 30 plus years, 30 to life, if convicted. And so it was a serious thing, which is another point, which just, one of the comments I heard one of the jurors make in deliberations, because we went into the deliberations and people thought we were going home. Most of the jurors thought this is a slam dunk. They're all guilty. Let's send in a guilty verdict and get out of here. We don't have to come tomorrow. And that's where I was like, well, let's take a look at this. Let's look a little harder at this, because these are very serious charges. These guys could be looking at life in prison. And I said that. And of course I didn't know. I didn't look up the I didn't know what the possible sentence was. The judge doesn't tell you. The judge actually does tell you, or told us, that we cannot take the punishment into account when making our decision. But we didn't know what the punishment was. They never told us. They never told us what it could possibly be. And I said, these guys, I think I said something like, these guys could be looking at 20 years or more. And I got laughed at. And the one guy said, we don't know what it is. You can't take that into consideration. But, they're probably looking at time served, which is laughable to think that the federal government is going to put this much time and effort and hold a 12-week trial to give them time served. It's just that's just complete ignorance of how the government works and how the state works. But that's what you're dealing with. And you only get one shot. That's the other thing that you realize while you're there. Like, when I'm talking about the roads to someone, I can practice. I can talk to people. I can try this argument, try that argument. This one didn't work. This one didn't work. I can go back to the guy in 3 months and talk again. When you're on a jury, you got one shot. And once that decision's in, it's over. And there's no practicing. There's no trying again. And so knowing where these people are coming from, it's how are you going to convince them? The government's case, which is funny, where I say there was no evidence of a conspiracy, there really wasn't. You have to take my word for it. But they never, ever talked about being a gang. What they did do, however, was show the very first thing the government came out with, their first piece of evidence on the first day of the trial, was pictures of one of the raids where they had the DEA going into the building wearing the hazmat suits. They look like they're going to take ET out. Okay. And that was their big piece of evidence. They talked about that throughout the entire trial. You need hazmat suits to do this. Stuff is so dangerous. And they brought someone on who said it can be absorbed through the skin. And they talked about what it does. It's a disassociative, but it's very highly dangerous. If you spill that, you're going to die essentially. And we need hazmat suits. Well, meanwhile, you have surveillance across the road and you're taping people walk out of there. But by the way, they didn't identify everybody. But you're letting this stuff that you're saying you need hazmat suits to handle, you're letting people, they have it in their pocket, and you're letting them walk out on the street. By your own definitions, you should be the criminal. You're letting this happen. If that was a bomb, if they're walking out with bombs, you think they're going to just let them walk out? Of course not. So they don't even believe the hazmat thing. I really do think that they show up with the hazmat suits because they know it could go to trial and they're going to use that as evidence. And part of the reason why I say that is there was 2 raids in this case, and in the other one, they didn't have, I forget what they call it, their mobile something unit, and that's where the hazmat suits are. So at the other raid, they did it both the same morning. The cop took a picture of himself handling it with his bare hands and testified, because there was no record of this and there was no video evidence or picture evidence, but testified that he put it in his squad car and drove it to the other site, which is about 40 minutes away. So if it's so dangerous that you need hazmat suits to handle it, why did you allow one of your own guys to put it in his car and drive it to to the spot? They didn't actually take any pictures of the evidence at one location, which is pretty crazy. The investigation was very sloppy, but that was their big piece of evidence: is this stuff is dangerous. They're putting this poison on our streets. This is, we got to lock these guys away. They never even argued that it was a conspiracy, yet they expect us to just say guilty because we're scared of PCP. It was really crazy to think how this probably happens every day.
Yeah, it's one of those things where you think, is it, how much of a coincidence is that, you as an ANCAP who has your views that you do and is going to be, looking real hard at the case that the state's going to bring. How much of a coincidence do you think that it's, you just happen to be on this case with really sloppy police work and really sloppy evidence? It's like, well, probably not. This is probably more indicative that this is the norm as opposed to the exception. And you hear stories on the news that are similar like this with how sloppy this work is and how corrupt the police are, let alone being sloppy. And so it just adds to the mountain of evidence that, man, they're not good dudes doing this.
And here's the other thing to realize, that I brought this up in deliberations and again got laughed at, but one side in this case knew this could potentially go to trial. It's not like there was surveillance video of a fight and you're trying to figure out who did it. Like, one guy or one side knew what they were doing. The other side had no idea. You shouldn't be that sloppy. There wasn't pictures taken. There wasn't notes taken. The guy actually, so he had to testify. What the DEA agent testified that he saw the main guy walking into the address at one of the buildings. And so when on cross-examination, they said, and did you take pictures of him? No, I did not. Did you put a report of it? They have to file a certain report. No, I did not. So now, as jurors, we're supposed to just take his word. So, of course, I'm like, well, no, you didn't have, you said you did it, but you didn't show any evidence of it. But that was what other jurors were saying. Well, he testified to it. He testified that he saw him there. And like, so how do you reason? How do you talk to someone? It's very challenging. But that's the guy even testified. This is a DEA agent, testified that lean, because they were talking about lean in one of the phone calls, is PCP. And he said he never heard of the term purple drank before. And I just can't believe that, knowing I'm a nerd from the suburbs and I know what that stuff is. You're a DEA agent who does this for a living, and you're telling me that lean is PCP. You're telling me you never heard of purple drank. Like, what do you do like with your job? You're on the DEA. So he's either completely unqualified to be on the DEA or to testify in this case, or he's lying. And I do believe he was lying. I believe he lied several times, actually. But that's how I perceived him.
Gotcha.
And I don't think he was lying because he's a DEA agent. I believe he's lying because I think he was a liar. His testimony actually changed throughout the course, and I believe he may have been charged. I don't know this for a fact, but something came up because one of the defendants was defending himself, he was asking questions, if you have ever been charged with misconduct or something, and the government kept objecting and overruling, but he was going down that line of questioning, and he even said, even in regards to this case where you sanctioned, or whatever the term is, for misconduct, and he answered yes, and then got objected to, and that was sustained. So something went on. I don't know what happened with the DEA agent. I don't know what he was charged with, if anything. There was actually he was a Philly cop on the drug task force. On one of the videos, the audio conveniently cuts out when the confidential source gets back in the car, but the cop in the front seat turns around to him and does the shush signal, tells him to stop, and kind of waves his hand across his neck, like, cut it out. and then puts his finger up to his mouth and shh, you know, and we don't know what he said because the audio conveniently cut out. But we do know this was testified to that he was double dealing the whole time. He never should have been used as a confidential source. He was stealing money from the DEA and selling drugs and contacting the main guy in this investigation. It was something like 80 times in the 4 weeks he was used as or 6 weeks he was used as a confidential source. They didn't get permission from his PO to be a confidential source. So this never should have been allowed, according to the defense attorney I spoke to, but they made a challenge. They made a really strong challenge to that, which with this challenge, these guys would have lost their job. And of course, you know, the judge, they all work together. They're all on the same team. They didn't allow that to go forward. So that's why that evidence was allowed to be used in court. Makes no sense to me, but that's what I was told.
So you're on this jury, and you already said that a lot of the fellow jurors, other than like 2 people, were not on your side at all, getting angry, getting frustrated. But you ended up getting these guys, a lot of them acquitted, some of them mistrialed. How did that happen? How did you go from the other jurors being combative to getting verdicts that were pretty good in your book? Not pretty good, but about as good as you could ever hope for as a result of this trial.
Yeah. So, well, for one, I was not going to convict on conspiracy, and I was holding out as long as possible. And for some of these guys, it was very clear that that we could make a case, whether it was the amount they purchased. The one guy was no evidence of PCP at all, yet there was still jurors saying he was guilty. You know, there was a little bit, I guess, of give and take. And what I'm thinking, you remember, been going through these deliberations for a long time, and you're in that room all day, no windows, no phones, no internet, no books. You're in this room with these people, and there was some obvious charges that if we say guilty to, they were lesser charges, they carry a lesser sentence. And there's also, we had to vote on the amount of possession. And my thinking is here, if I continue to say not guilty. Now, one thing to note here, the defense attorney at the end of his closing said, if you want to find him guilty on these charges, we're not going to complain, but look really hard at this one. And so that was in my back pocket. And still, you know, you can tell where it's going. I'm not comfortable even saying it. I'm not proud of it, but we did say guilty on some possession charges. However, we got to vote on the amount of possession they had, and some jurors wanted to get him for the maximum. And there was 3 levels, and we were able to get the minimum. And maybe this is rationalization after the fact, but this was my thinking going in. Once I relented there, they were more willing to talk about the other guys. And I don't like the idea of trading lives. But if I look at what I believe were the only 2 options, is a mistrial on all charges and all 7 get retried, or we get the main guy on the smaller charges and get minimum possession, by the way, the minimum amount, which is a difference. It's a big difference in years. I don't know what it is, but it was huge that we got the minimum amount of possession, as opposed to the maximum, which would have been a very long jail sentence. And so my thought is, the attorney said, if you find him guilty here, we're not going to complain too much, but look hard at these ones. So if we get a mistrial on everything, like I said, they get retried, and maybe all 7 of them are guilty. We had most of the jurors thought all of them were guilty when we went into deliberations. If they're guilty on everything, I mean, this guy goes away for life, no doubt about it. If he gets maximum possession, maximum amount attributed to him. But once I was able to do that, I guess they thought I was a little more reasonable, and I was able to get the other 3 guys out. I say there was 2 other people who were right there with me. And I don't want to take anything away from them because they fought very hard and they were very good jurors. And, but that was difficult. And I still think about it all the time. But when I know, had I not done that, the retrial, these guys are guilty. I just had that feeling based on the way the jury went.
Yeah, I mean, you get shoved into a situation that you don't really want to be in, and sometimes you got to look into the dark abyss of reality and say there are no good solutions. There are no perfect solutions to this outcome. So, I mean, you do you try to create the most good, which I think you obviously did.
Well, that was my goal. I wanted the best outcome. And when I did talk to that guy's attorney, the guy we said guilty on, and I apologized. And now he's an attorney and I'm a juror. He's not going to scold me, but no, he said this was a great verdict for them. And he mentioned the fact, he said, you realize the fact that they got the minimum amount attributed to him is very big in sentencing. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's like, what do you do? If it gets retried and they get the max, well, how did that help the guys who were really affected? I get to go home after this. No matter what our decision was, I could go home. I could have went in there and said guilty to everything. We could have been out of there in 5 minutes. But we fought hard for these guys, and we got 3 people out. I mean, I met with all 3 of them in person. We had lunch together. And they're very happy to be out of prison. And knowing, you know, they told me after the fact they were facing a long time up to life in jail had they been convicted. And, you know, I'm happy with the result. I wish it could have been better, but I don't believe, knowing how the deliberations went, I don't believe it could have been better. I think we got the best possible verdict here. And the guys, they're being retried. And that was another thought I had after the trial is, okay, well, the main guy was guilty on these smaller charges. Maybe they'll just give up. And of course they didn't. They're recharging the 4 who had mistrials on conspiracy. They're being retried in October. So I tried hard. I tried hard to get not guilty on everything. And I actually was told this in deliberations. One person said, my problem is I believe everything the government tells me. Another thing I heard was, don't make analogies. I hate analogies. I can't stand analogies. No more analogies. And I was trying to compare this organization to something that I do for a living, where I'm a wholesaler. So I have several clients we all have individual agreements with. They don't care if they don't even want me to make money. They want to make all the money. So we have separate agreements. There isn't a conspiracy. And I was shouted down with that. And they said, yeah, but selling insurance isn't illegal. This is illegal. I'm like, well, that's not the point. The point is the relationship. I can't take, that doesn't even make sense to me. I can't even think that way. So, you know, you're in a tough spot. And people, when I would say, I remember a guy got up and yelled at me because I said, guys, these are very serious. Like, think before you just say guilty. These are very serious charges. The guy stood up and said, PCP is a very serious drug. It's like, but they're not. PCP isn't on trial for being a serious drug. This is a conspiracy trial. And guys just don't want to hear it. I mean, there was one of the defendants actually didn't mention PCP at all on any of the wiretaps. There was no evidence against him. What I found out later was, and maybe he was supplying it, we don't know, because there was absolutely no evidence of it. But that's what the government alleged, is that he was the main supplier to the main guy in this case. And what they were hoping was that one of the defendants would flip and testify against him, but none of them did. And so they actually had nothing on him. But that doesn't change the fact that he was in prison for 27 months awaiting trial. And he went through a lot of hardships for that, even though he was eventually acquitted. I don't know where I was going to go other than the frustration. I thought deliberation would be easier. I mean, I was nervous going in. I knew this was my one shot. But I argue difficult things all the time with people, and I thought I could handle it pretty well. But when you get shut down, you're not even allowed to make analogies. People just didn't want to hear it. And
it's not like a lot of the jurors weren't even aware of what they were supposed to be
No,
deliberating on,
and
you
we
know?
kept reading these instructions over and over again, and I kept trying to put it in other words to explain, like, this has to be an organization. This isn't, and they just they didn't want to hear it at all. They just had it in their mind, these guys are bad guys. When another funny thing was, they all have nicknames. I mean, most, like, I have nicknames for my friends. Rollo has a nickname when I talk to him. And it's just funny as we went into, it's not funny, actually, it's kind of disturbing, but you hear things like, they put their nicknames up there. They were not, the government did a great job of dehumanizing these people, because it was all jokes. It was all jokes the whole time about these people and the language they use and the names they use. They sell some of the PCP in Snapple bottles, so they'll call it a Snapple, and, like, so some guy would go out and buy Snapple and joke about how he has Snapple. It's not funny at all. Like, the guy wasn't funny. He thought he was. And when we went into deliberations, when I said, let's slow down and look at this, they, like, rolled their eyes at me, went up to the whiteboard and wrote down all their nicknames and said, like, his baby mama was in the audience. It's like, you don't know who that girl was, and why are you calling her baby mama? You don't know who she is. It could be his sister. But it's just like it was really disturbed. I don't know. I'm not giving it justice of how disturbed I was at the conversation in deliberations, at just how dehumanizing it was. And they're laughing at all their nicknames. And it was sad, because these are human beings over there across the room from us. And I say that I'm thinking of certain jurors in particular. I said there was two other jurors who were great. They were right there. They looked at it. They took it serious. They knew the impact of this case. I think there was some jurors who didn't care one way or the other. They just wanted to get out of there. If most of the people said not guilty, they were going to vote not guilty. If most of the people said guilty, they were going to vote guilty. They didn't care. And then there was some other jurors who I thought gave it an honest effort. And knowing that drugs are involved, the defense didn't even deny that they were involved in the drug trade. So it was easy to say guilty because, and I said it earlier, but I heard this from jurors, I made better decisions with my life. But what's important here is the charges. If they charge them with possession, okay, I think they probably would have pled guilty to it, because why go through a whole trial with a longer sentence? But they believe there was no conspiracy, and I believe that as well. So it was tough in deliberations. A lot of them came around, but there was really one guy was the ringleader, but there was two or three, probably closer to four of them, who were just guilty on everything all the time and didn't want to relent. And even once we got the three acquittals, of course, I was quick to put that on the jury sheet, had the foreman go ahead and write that in, not guilty, right there. Let's send it to the judge and tell her we're not getting anywhere with these. I kind of expected the judge to send us back and deliberate more, because she did once. And the court deputy told us sometimes deliberations take over a month. So I thought she was going to send us back and try again, but she accepted the verdict. And that's another thing. I was doing that. I kept encouraging the foreman to send it to the judge, because it was almost like a stall tactic, I guess. I wanted time to think about it and make a better case for the lesser charges, but we did have three not guilties, and I know how rare that is in federal court, and she did accept it, and that was it. That was the end. So I don't know. It was a long trial. There's a lot I could go into about. I know there was something else I was going to say about the dehumanizing these people, but it slipped my mind. So anyway,
that's all right. You already submitted a lot of information about this already, and there's definitely more to come that we're going to cover on this. But do you have anything else that you wanted to kind of wrap up with on this?
I think that after talking to these guys and meeting them, and I mean, we hung out. I have their phone numbers. I text them. We've become somewhat of friends, and they're people like anyone else. And I know most of the people listening to this probably get that. We don't know their situation, where they were raised, what pressures there was, what they did. What I do know is that some of these guys had no idea why they were arrested. Um, they had no clue they were involved in this. They find it hard to get jobs when you get out after being in federal prison for a couple of years, even though they were acquitted. It really affects their lives. And if you get jury duty, it's very stressful. It's very hard. At least it was for me. Maybe some of you guys could handle it better. But my goal was to get the best possible outcome. And I think I did that. But the fact that I didn't go in there and get out of jury duty, because no one wants to do it. No one on the jury wants to be there. But by getting out of the jury, now you have I understand you don't have a responsibility to anyone else's lives, but if you want to make an immediate impact on someone's life, get on a jury and pay attention to the defense and make the case, because if you can get 12 people to, or 11 other people to agree, you change someone's life immediately. And in this case, we got 3 guys who aren't in a cage anymore. And they're very grateful, and they don't deserve to be in a cage. And thankfully, they got a jury who was willing to listen. As frustrated as I was with the jurors on this case, all 12 of us agreed, even if some of it was begrudgingly, agreed to say not guilty. And for that, they have their they have their freedom. And so, just if you get jury duty, do what you want with it. Throw it out. Go in and say, I'm an anarchist, or go in and say, I don't trust the state, or I'm a racist, or I hate Muslims, or whatever it is you want to say to get out. That's fine. That's your decision. But just understand what impact you can have if you do serve and you are able to get someone acquitted. It's life-changing.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully it kind of cascades down into maybe they're not as aggressive in trying these cases in the future, since they can't get guilty verdicts, knowing that they're going to spend a lot of time, money, and resources and end up not getting that notch in their lipstick case over it. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely amazing what you're able to accomplish. And, we're all, people listening to this, you and I, we're all libertarians trying to make an impact, positive impact on the world. And a lot of what we advocate for, at least, is kind of longer term stuff. It's slow. You're not going to see the, because we're trying to make the state obsolete, not necessarily trying to overthrow the state outright. Right. So it can get frustrating because you don't see the impact on what you're doing right away. But something like this, like you were saying, it is immediate, and it really can put someone on a much better track for their lives. So it's a great thing, and I think it's important that people understand what it really is like to be on a jury and to do something like this, especially if you never have done it. I know just talking to you about it here and hearing you explain it a bunch of times, it really helped put me in the right frame of mind on how to do this. And I really think that if I didn't hear you explain everything that you went through and what I might expect in the future, that I probably would have messed it up.
Well, I don't know. I thought I did the best I could. I thought we got a good verdict. It's not as easy as I thought it was going to be. Not guilty is definitely better than a mistrial, and a mistrial is better than a guilty. I'm not proud, but I know I believe that was the way to get the not guilties.
Yep.
And yeah, I got to live with it, and they got to live with it. But had that not happened, like I said, I always repeat it. We don't know if all 7 of them get retried, if all 7 of them are guilty. And we don't know about the amount attributed to the main guy, what happens there. I have a feeling a strong feeling that because when we went into deliberations, most of the room thought it was easily guilty on everything. We're going home tonight and it's over. The trial ended at like 3 p.m. and they thought we would be out of there by 5, done. Like there was going to be no discussion if I didn't speak up. That's how guilty these people were to some of the other jurors. And so overcoming that and changing the minds of 11 people, really 9 people, because 2 people were, as soon as I don't like to kind of make it sound like I'm taking credit for this, but we all kind of sat there and everyone, the feeling in the room was guilty. And I spoke up and these other 2 people were right there with me. Had I not spoken up, I'm sure they would have. But yeah, it was quite an experience. You'll probably hear more about it. I actually just got a text from one of the guys right now.
Nice.
Yeah, so I'm sure you'll be hearing more about this, and I hope to give their side of the story, or let them give their side of the story. And I thought that would be interesting to hear from what their perspective was, what was going through their mind, what it was like being in prison, even though you're not guilty and you know you're not guilty. And that's what they said to me was, I have no problem doing time for something I did, but I'm not going to plead guilty to something I didn't do. And in this case, it was a conspiracy. So they clearly saw what the charges were and they knew what the charges were. But all us jurors, we're regular guys. We're not legal scholars. We're not invested the way they are. And the charges get thrown out there and the drug is scary and the people are scary and the language they use on the phone is scary. And they need to be in prison. And that usually wins the day, it seems. So I don't know. I know I'm repeating myself. My mind's still racing over this case as I think of all kinds of stuff about it. So anyway, that's all I got. If you have questions for me, reach out on Twitter. And you'll hear more. You'll hear more about this case, I'm sure of it.
Yeah. I'll probably name this part 1 of whatever, because there's going to be more.
Yep.
So, all right. Do you have a free market success story?
No.
Since that was the episode of full-on statism.
Yeah. Now, and whenever I get in the mode in this case, getting that frame of mind, my mind goes back to it. I'm reeling right now. So
okay, so I can save the day for you. So another last week in the free market success story, I talked about the fishing trip and taking the Dramamine and how that helped me. Well, there's another part of that. After we came back from the trip, we came back with 40. We kept 49 fish, but came back with 48 fish because one of the bonita, we actually, the mate cut it up for us and we ate it raw out in the ocean, and it was absolutely delicious. But you're out, you're waking up real early in the morning to go fishing. You go on a fishing trip. A lot of us had Dramamine in us, so there's some drowsy effects to that towards the end of the day. So kind of the last thing you want to do after you get off this boat is go home and clean fish. So when we were coming back in, the mate called the fish cleaners, and they met us basically at the dock, and you hand them the fish. They filleted them up for us. We paid them the bill, what they were charging, and it was really reasonable for especially that number of fish. And they made some money. We got fish cleaned for us at a nice little service, and they came to where we were. We didn't have to go to a store. They drove to where the boat was coming in. So it was a nice little experience to cap off the day with that. And guess what? Some of the seagulls got a meal out of it because they were kind of throwing the scraps at them. Actually, it was funny. It's watching people who are good at the craft. One just kind of filleting up this fish, doing it much better than I ever could. But they started throwing some of the scraps at the seagulls, and he kind of made the comment eventually. He's just like, I'm not trying to be a nice guy to them. It's if I can keep them over there, they're not flying over us and pooping and trying to steal the actual fillet. So good times had by all. So with that, remember again, the show notes page is mcflugel.com/153. Are there any links that you think would be appropriate to throw in there for this? I don't think they're.
No, it's just me talking.
Okay.
I've never written about it or anything. So,
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you go to the show notes page, libertymugs.com, buy a mug or 2 or 3 or 1 million. And also check out 10hoursbitcoin.com. And also, wherever you're catching this podcast, subscribe to us, give us a review and a rating. It really helps us out. And also share the podcast, especially this one. I think this is a really important topic and a really important case study for something that any of us can find ourselves involved in. So I think it's important to get this word spread out about a good example of how to do this. So thanks for listening, everyone, and we will catch you next week.
Peace.